Hey, welcome back to the channel. While checking my chain tension prior to an upcoming ride, I noticed a clicking sound coming from my hub when I rotated the wheel. So I took the wheel off and found a bad bearing, so I ordered the bearings from my Ducati dealer. So I'm now going to replace them for your viewing pleasure. Each bearing and seal was approximately $15 each. Now, before I disassemble anything, I always make sure that the seal and bearings look correct. Make sure that the axle fits through the bearings and make sure the side spacers fit into the openings of the seals. I also compare the new parts to the current installed parts, such as the seals, to get a quick gut check as to if the parts are correct or not. If I disassemble the bike and I have the wrong parts, I'm kind of stuck. I'm going to start with the wheel off the bike. For information about removal and installation of the rear wheel for a 2020 Ducati Multistrada Enduro, check out the link above. I have also already removed the Sprocket spring hub assembly. It just pulls out of the hub. There are no bolts or clips to remove. First, I removed the seal on the disc side. I couldn't find my seal puller, so I used a large pry bar instead. You want to use something that will not damage the outer hub, and the pry bar fit really well. I then cleaned up the old grease and saw that this bearing has to be removed after the other side. This is also the side that had the bad bearing. It turns a little bit and then seizes. So I flipped the tire and removed that seal as well. You have to remove the sprocket side bearing first because there are two notches in the inner spacer between the bearings for the puller to be able to grab the bearing. I first tried to use a smaller and flimsier puller, however the bearing wasn't moving. So I grabbed the larger single hook attachment for my puller, and that was able to break it loose. I was then able to get the two-legged puller attachment between the bearings and the inner spacer to more evenly remove the bearing. As you can see from the inner spacer, there are the two notches where the puller has to fit to be able to pull on the bearing. I then flipped the wheel over and worked on the disc side bearing. The bearing didn't want to come free, so I flipped it back over and used a punch to get the bearing moving. I did put a couple pieces of wood under the wheel so that I wasn't hammering on the disc and the wheel rotation sensor disc. After it broke loose, the normal puller was able to make quick work of the bearing and get it out. I then cleaned up the surfaces and found a large socket which would apply the force to the outer portion of the new bearing. I then hammered the new bearing into the hub, watching that it was going in evenly. I then grabbed my safety glasses, which I should have had on while hammering on the socket, and I blew the small metal shavings out of the hub. I then cleaned up the inner spacer and used a file to clean up the rough edges I made when I was removing the bearings with the puller. I didn't want any sharp points rubbing on the bearing or the axle. After everything was all cleaned up, I put the inner spacer into the hub and installed the other bearing. I do think either the spacer or the hub was milled incorrectly at the factory though, because after I installed the second bearing, it was tied against the inner spacer and was binding. So I had to use the puller to pull the bearing away from the spacer and double check the inner spacer freedom of movement. It was rotating fine and the bearing was also spinning freely like I wanted. So I gently tapped the bearing back to the bottom and it bound up again. I then used the bearing puller to gently pull on the bearing again evenly on each side until the bearing spun with no resistance or binding. The binding issue was a similar issue I observed on the original bearing, so I believe that something isn't milled quite right, which likely caused what I consider a premature failure with only 10,000 miles on the bike. I then used micrometers to measure the distance from the outer part of the hub to the face of the bearing. There was only 0.005 of an inch difference between each side of the bearing, so it was good to go in my book. I then installed the seal using a large overheaded mallet. If the seal starts to go in wrong and bind, don't force it. Pull it out and start over. Make sure it starts more evenly and flat. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and informative, and hopefully it helps you decide whether or not that this is something that you'd like to tackle yourself or spend hundreds of dollars having the dealership do it for you. Make sure to subscribe and give the video a thumbs up to support the channel.